Alright, hello. Folks, this week we will be looking at the visual elements of art. What are the visual elements of art? Well, they are color, shape, line, light, value, texture, space, time, and motion. Together, these 9 elements make up the language of art. Instead of using symbols and words to communicate, the language of art relies on visual elements and principles of design. The composition of these elements forms the style, form, and content of the work. Learning the visual elements is learning the vocabulary of the language of art. So, let's look at each one of these individually and in some depth. Starting with line. Line is the simplest and most complex of the elements of art. It serves as the basic building block for all art. It has the capacity to evoke thoughts and emotions. It can be thought of as a moving dot and can be used to measure distance. As an example, here are 2 very different compositions by Sol LeWitt and Jackson Pollock that both use almost entirely line for composition and both have very different feel and aesthetic qualities to them. As we just saw, lines can be straight, curved, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, or even zigzag. For example, in this photograph of a squirrel on a tree branch, the 2 branches are both a little zigzagged and mostly horizontal, so lines can fall into several of these categories at the same time. There are 4 main types of lines. Contour lines are created by the edges of things or shapes. They are perceived when 3-dimensional shapes curve back into space or overlap. Actual lines are connected and continuous. Sometimes it can be difficult to discern whether something is a line or a very narrow rectangle, for instance. Implied lines are a discontinuous line that is completed by the viewer due to the context of the piece. For instance, a dotted line is an implied line. It's not a full, straight, thick line. It's a series of dots that our brain interprets as a line. Psychological lines are lines that aren't really there but are created mentally by our perceptions. For instance, if a character points towards an object in a painting, our brain will follow their finger and their eyes and create a line across the composition. Okay, so here we have examples of a couple different kinds of line. A shows us an actual line. B is showing us an implied line of dashes. And then C is showing us a sort of psychological line that our line makes by connecting the ends of all the straight actual lines that are horizontal. So, as an in-class activity, take out a piece of paper, draw 6 roughly 2-inch by 2-inch squares, and fill each one with a different type of parallel line pattern. I'm going to keep going, so go ahead and pause the video while you do that. Some more information about line. Edges are perceived because objects differ from the background in value, texture, or color. Shading can be used to give model roundness. And a hallmark of the Renaissance painting is to use implied lines to create or echo structures in the composition. Some examples. This is a photograph by Edward Weston called Knees, and in it we can see several examples of contour lines. Contour lines are the edges of shapes. So for instance, if we follow this line around here, around this knee, that's a contour line, as is this line defining the shape of the other knee, also a contour line. Even this on the inside we could say is a contour line. Now if we look at this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, we can see the type of Renaissance compositional psychological structure I just mentioned. So we have the painting on the left, and then on the right we can see some of the psychological structure lines implied over it, where the composition has this sort of pyramid shape to it. Very clearly on the left-hand side, going from the woman's head, down her arm, down the head and back of the cherub, and then also on the other side, head, arm, shoulder, and back, with the second figure, creating a triangle structure to the composition. So now you can see those lines aren't actually there, but psychologically our brain connects the different shapes to build that very stable triangular pyramid structure for the painting. Another example of psychological line. In this painting there are two very prominent psychological lines, both involving the eyes of the people in the painting. So if we look at the little boy and the man examining the painting, you can see from his eyes to his eyes, even though he's looking down at the painting, the boy is very clearly looking at the man's eyes, creating a line across the composition here. The woman, on the other hand, is looking down, almost straight down, at her toe that's exposed under the hem of her dress, right? So that creates another structural line here, which forms a sort of cross pattern in the composition. This painting by Emily Mary Osborne also is an example of some other great lines we can look at. For instance, the framing of these windows, we could say, are contour lines, whereas we could interpret the post in between the two panes of glass here as an actual line. It's a thick line, but it's an actual line. Likewise with this column, another actual line. Alright, get your pens and paper out. In the next image, I'm going to show you a series of arrows, and I want you to try to identify what kind of line the arrows are pointing at. Try to also identify how the line functions in the image. Does the line show direction or movement? Does it outline a shape? Does it give texture to some element in the painting? Does it create a shadow or an illusion? And then see if you can identify if there are any implied or psychological lines giving balance to the composition. So here's the painting by Botticelli called The Birth of Venus. It's a very large tempera painting that you can see in Florence, Italy, at the Academy of Art. Go ahead and pause the video while you do this activity, and I am going to continue. So, if we look at the top up here at A, pointing to the angel's hair, I would say those are actual lines, actual squiggly lines making the hair. B is a tricky one. It's this sort of very translucent breath, but very clearly going from the angel's mouth towards Venus. That is an implied line. Going down to C, pointing at the edge of the shell that she's standing in, that's a contour line. D is likewise a contour line, the edge of her leg. And the last one, E, again pointing at Venus's hair this time, would also be a actual line. Now, as for the psychological lines and the composition, there's a fairly dominant line from her head down the side of these two angels and their legs, and then another steeper one cut between Venus and the woman bringing a robe to wrap her in, which gives the whole composition a slightly off balance triangular structure. So what are the different functions of lines? Lines can outline shapes. They can create form. They can create depth and texture, and even suggest direction and movement. Different types of line have different implications in a composition as well. For instance, horizontal lines suggest stability, vertical lines defy gravity and suggest assertiveness, whereas diagonal lines imply movement and directionality. So here's an example by Rima Drilovina, where the shape of a child in the image is outlined by a line of braided hair. In this image, by Jacob Lawrence, different types of line suggest different things. The horizontal contour line of the horizon here, between the sky and the ground, creates a stable platform for these children to be playing on. And you can see their bodies are we could almost describe them as just actual lines. They're sort of just thickened stick figures, but they have so much movement, so much action and liveliness, and that's largely because of all the diagonal lines, right? Other lines, like the arm and leg here on this child, that are more vertical, give her the stability and assertiveness to propel herself off of that surface. Lines can also be used to create texture in primarily 4 different ways. Modeling is the creation of the illusion of roundness, or the third dimension, through use of light and shadow. Usually a smooth gradient creates a modeling effect. Stippling uses a pattern of dots that thickens and thins to give a sense of volume. Hatching uses a series of closely spaced parallel lines to achieve shading. And cross-hatching uses a series of parallel lines that overlap in different directions to give an object different valued areas. As an example, you can see example A shows stippling of a sort of elliptical volume. B shows hatching of the same shape, and you can see the more even hatching makes it look much flatter than it does in A. C shows cross-hatching, which creates the illusion of a rectangular prism, and then D shows some contour hatching. where the lines are parallel but curved. So, as an in-class activity, take out your paper and draw 4 roughly 2x2 squares and fill each with a different kind of texture. You can pause the video while you do that. I'm going to continue. Here's an example by Elizabeth Catlett using depth and texture through a series of lines. You can see how the spacing of the lines creates different values. So the underside of the brim of the hat that has less densely spaced white hatch marks is darker because it's in the shadow, whereas the background has a lot more closely packed white hatch marks, making it lighter in value. Also, notice how just the direction, though there's no real cross-hatching here, but the difference in the direction of the background and that, which are mostly vertical, and the brim of the hat, which are diagonal, helps differentiate these two different surfaces in the image, giving it a sense of space. Okay, that wraps up line. Let's take a look at shape. Shape are the areas within a composition that have boundaries separating them from what surrounds them. Shapes make those areas distinct. Shapes are formed when intersecting or connecting lines enclose a space. Shape can also be communicated through patches of color and texture. So, here's a painting by Pierre Mondrian called Composition with Red, Blue, and Yellow. And in this we can see several shapes. There's the red rectangular shape, the blue and yellow ones, and also all of the white rectangular shapes, which are created by the intersecting black lines. Just as a sort of side note, Pierre Mondrian was originally a landscape painter, and through the course of his painting career evolved his style into these sort of red, blue, and yellow with black and white lines compositions. And it became a very popular movement in the 1930s called De Stijl, which was started by a man actually named Theo van Doesburg in Holland. And De Stijl, if we translate it, means the style. And what they were trying to do was to create an international style that people all over the world could understand. So they used simple shapes, rectangles, and basic colors, red, blue, and yellow. And it's important to think about why this would be happening in context with other things that were happening at the time in these countries. So 1930s was right after World War I, before World War II, so in this weird transitionary period. These are coming out of Europe, so they're not dealing with the Great Depression the way the United States is. But after World War I, which was much more devastating in Europe than in the United States, artists tried to come together to make something that would bring people together, an art that everyone could understand, right? So that's why they're trying to do this De Stijl movement. When we talk about shape, form also often comes up. Form has more to do with 3D works of art, however. And we can see in this sculpture by Helen Brandt how, again, line is used to create intersecting in different three-dimensional forms. Volume then refers to the mass or bulk of a three-dimensional work. It is the amount of space it contains. And volume can also be created by intersecting shapes. So this house by Gerrit Rietveld in Utrecht, which is in Holland, he was also part of the De Stijl movement. You can see similar to the Mondrian painting, very organized geometrical rectilinear shapes with red and black accenting lines. So, let's look at the different kinds of shapes we have. There's geometric shapes and organic shapes. In the geometric shapes, we've got rectilinear ones and curvilinear ones. In the organic shapes, we've got biomorphic and amorphous ones. So let's look at some examples of all these different kinds of shapes. Here on the left, we can see a sculpture by David Smith made out of rectilinear shapes. On the right, we have curvilinear shapes. Now, it can be tricky to distinguish a curvilinear geometric shape from an organic shape sometimes, but if the shape looks like it could be drawn with a compass or is very even, it's probably a geometric curvilinear shape, because the organic shapes look much different. So a biomorphic shape sort of mimics something we might find in nature or in our bodies, right? So this ceramic piece has a very sort of organy type shape. Amorphous shapes might be the hardest to identify, but they're the ones that have very blurred or unclear or undefined edges. So if we look at the painting by Helen Frankenthaler there, it's not the contour lines created between the deep violet and the yellow ochre. They're not straight, they're not really curvilinear, they don't look like they were drawn with a compass or some kind of other mechanical drawing equipment. It also doesn't look very biomorphic. It doesn't look like a tree or a spleen or some other natural entity. It's just kind of blobby shapes. So we call those amorphous. We can also have positive and negative shapes. Positive shapes are the objects or figures that a viewer focuses on, whereas the negative shapes are the empty space or the leftover space that can be thought of as between the positive shapes or behind the positive shapes. We also talk about these things in a figure-ground relationship, which is the relationship between the positive and negative shapes in a piece. Usually, the figure is a positive and the ground is a negative, but there are figure-ground reversals when the positive and negative shapes in a piece can be reversed or are ambiguous. For example, we can take a look at a Rubin face. So, depending on how you see this, you may see a black vase on a white background, in which case you're looking at the black vase as a positive shape, the figure in the foreground, and the white negative space is in the background. However, you may look at this and see two faces, in which case you're seeing the two faces as the positive foreground and the black as a negative background space. It's also important to note that some shapes are viewed as icons. They're very recognizable, and because we're humans and we have society and culture, they mean certain things to different groups of people. So for instance, Christian cross, the Jewish Star of David, Chinese yin-yang, all these shapes are very recognizable to us in Western culture and have particular meaning to people who are either Christian or Jewish or Chinese. Alright, let's talk about mass and volume for a little bit as well. Shapes can combine to give a piece actual or implied mass. Objects that occupy three-dimensional space have actual mass and measurable volume and weight, whereas paintings and photographs may contain objects that have implied mass or create the illusion of possessing volume. As an example, Rachel Whiteread's Holocaust Memorial in Vienna has a great deal of actual mass. You can see from the photograph a large cement-like structure takes up a lot of volume, and we can tell that because of the scale between it and the people surrounding it. Now, you might be trying to figure out what this is. If you look very carefully, it is a cement cast of the inside of a library room. You can see the doors towards the front, and the lines are where the shelves were, the cement filling in where the books would be. So Rachel Whiteread is doing a play on positive and negative space, where she's taking the negative space, the empty space of a library room, and filling it with concrete and then peeling the walls of the library off, leaving you with a positive of that negative space. Whereas in this painting by Mark Tansey, it has a lot of implied mass and implied weight. We see these great monolithic, ruined statues and figures piled up, but it's just a painting. It doesn't actually weigh as much as the Sphinx. It just looks very heavy because of the composition and our association between how he's rendered these items and the materials we believe them to be made out of. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about light and value. Visible light is the part of the spectrum of light, of the electromagnetic spectrum, that we can see. Light enables us to see lines, shapes, and texture, as well as the visible spectrum through wavelengths of energy that we recognize as color. Without light, there is no art. So here's an example where the light is illuminating a figure in the background where there are two dark silhouetted figures in the foreground. We can tell they're figures, though, that have shape and three-dimensionality because of how the light is hitting the surfaces of their bodies, right? They're not just complete black profile lines. We can see a little bit of light reflecting off the figure on the left's head and then the arm of the figure on the right, giving them some dimensionality. When we talk about value, we're talking about the lightness or darkness of a color. Value contrast is the degrees of difference between shades of gray or light and dark colors. using contrast to draw figures makes them easier to see. The value pattern of an image describes the variation in light and dark within composition. So let's take a look at some contrast examples. Across the top here, we can see 7 squares, each with a circle in the middle of them. The squares go from very dark gray on the left to very light gray on the right. Interestingly, the circle in the middle of each square is the same shade of gray, but it looks much darker on the right hand side than it does on the left hand side. And we'll talk about why that is when we get into talking about color. The circle and square in the middle, the circle has a black line around it because those are actually the same shade of gray. When we say that there's high contrast, there's a large difference between shades of gray, whereas a low contrast, there's very little difference between the shades of gray. So if you look at the examples on the right, letter A is an example of low contrast, where the difference between the gray background and the gray text is very small. It's kind of hard to read. B and C, however, are both examples of high contrast, where the background is white and the text is black, or vice versa. It's a lot easier to read. So take out your paper and draw 6 2-inch by 2-inch squares. Shade each one with a pencil so that you have a progressive gradient of grays, just like at the top of the slide here, with a very dark gray on the left and a very light gray on the right. You can pause the video while you do that. I'm going to keep moving on. So there's this term, chiaroscuro, which is Italian for the shifting from light to dark through successive gradation of values across a curved surface. This is another way to refer to modeling that we talked about earlier. As an example, this black and white chalk drawing on gray paper looks almost real, very voluminous. And it's because of how the shading of values was done very gradually through an even gradient to give the illusion of curved surfaces in the figure. So, values can be descriptive and expressive. They may be used to describe objects, or may be used to evoke emotional response in the viewer. Here's an example of Lorraine O'Grady, and you can see in this image she's wearing a very bright white dress because of how it's lit, and in the background it's very dark, and there's some figures behind her, but they're very hard to see because they have low value contrast compared to her in the middle with the negative space of the background. Interesting thing you can see about this image, her dress is made out of long white gloves, and in this piece in 1981 she was actually protesting this opening at the new museum in New York because in their exhibition they had almost no representation of work by artists of color. And she was protesting that by making this dress out of the gloves that sort of well-to-do people who would go to museum openings would wear. And you can see her sort of like very excited expression on her face. She's yelling out a bunch of statistics about the collections of museums. For instance, another thing I think she was talking about was, at that time, the majority of figure paintings in museum collections were of women. The majority of nude figure paintings were of women, whereas the majority of artists represented in the museum's collection were by male artists. So there's a disconnect there between the content being produced and who was producing that content. Let's look at texture. It's derived from the Latin word for weaving, and it's used to describe the surface characteristics of things through the sense of touch. Artists can emphasize or distort texture of an object in order to evoke emotional responses in the viewer. And we have this term impasto, which is a thick buildup of paint on the surface of a canvas. Here's an example of Impasto by Leon Kossoff. And we can tell right away, not only from the expression of the character's face, but by the gesture of the brushstrokes and a thick paint, this guy just looks a little discontent, right? So let's look at some different types of texture. Actual texture is the texture you can touch, what something feels like. So that impasto paint, you could actually touch it and feel the texture of it. Visual texture is simulated texture. It looks like actual texture, but it's not. It's actually smooth or flat. And we have this French word trompe-l'oeil for a style of painting that tricks the eye, so making you think that something has a texture like a marbled surface when it's actually just paint. Then there's subversive texture, and subversive texture is chosen or created by the artist to subvert or undermine your ideas about the objects they depict. So here's an example of a trompe-l'oeil painting by Rachel Roish of flowers. And, well, it looks like these flowers have a great texture, like you could reach out and touch the petals. It is just a painting. It's perfectly flat. There's no real texture there. The texture's all coming from the overlapping shapes and the value contrast in the petals. That's how the artist creates that illusion. Versus Murray Oppenheim's object, which is a fur-covered saucer and spoon, has actual texture but also subversive texture, because she's trying to get us to think differently about how we might initially perceive a cup and saucer, right? Going from thinking about, oh, maybe I could have a cup of coffee or tea, to, oh, I really don't want to put that in my mouth. Another one of our visual elements is space. Objects exist in three-dimensional space. Some art is truly three-dimensional, such as sculpture and architecture. Other art tries to depict space on a two-dimensional surface, as with painting, drawing, or printmaking. So how do we create space? One way is to overlap objects. So here, the light pink circles seem like they are closer to us than the dark pink circles. This is also an example of a implied shape, where our minds connect the part of the circle we can't see. So our minds fill in this and we're like, oh yeah, that's just a circle, it's just that this is on top of it blocking the view. Even with this one, our minds will go, oh yeah, that's a circle, it's just this is blocking the view. We don't necessarily see this as a crescent shape with a circle right next to it. Another thing that helps build depth in this image is the value contrast. The lighter things appear closer to us and the darker things fade into the background. Something that image didn't depict, though, was relative size in linear perspective. The further objects are from the viewer, the smaller they look. So had those dark pink circles been slightly smaller than the light pink ones as well, they would have even looked further away. Things that are close to us look larger. Artists use different techniques like relative size and linear perspective to create an illusion of depth in a piece of art. So, as an in-class activity, draw 4 roughly 2 by 2 squares on a piece of paper and fill each one with a different composition of overlapping shapes, and see if you can vary the sizes of them to make some seem closer to the viewer and some further away. You could also try shading them with a pencil with different value contrasts to see if you can also use that to make some shapes look closer or farther away. I'm going to continue. While you do that, please pause the video if you need more time. So, the illusion of depth can be created with perspective. In perspective, there are several different kinds, and they require different things. A vanishing point in a perspective drawing is a point in which lines seem to come together or converge, lines that we may know to be parallel. For instance, if you are standing out in the desert on some train tracks looking down the tracks, you will see those lines eventually come together to a single point, even though you know that those lines actually don't ever touch because the train would not be able to go down them. The horizon line is the line where the line of sight stops and is often a place that holds a vanishing point. It's also the line that divides usually the land or sea from the sky. The vantage point is the point where the viewer is looking from, which can be a tricky thing to think about. But when you're drawing a perspective drawing, it's important to consider where in the artificial space that you're creating is the viewer standing and looking from. It's usually not on the canvas or paper you're working on. So in one-point perspective is when all the lines in the picture are coming together into one point, the vanishing point usually on the horizon. In two-point perspective, there are 2 different points that lines are going to, depending on which side of the image the object is. There's even a 3-point perspective. Here's an example. So on the left, we have the linear perspective with a 1 vanishing point in the middle. You can see the arches sort of all shrinking down towards that one vanishing point on the horizon. On the right, we've got 2 examples of 2-point perspective. And you can see where the different sides of the object vanish towards vanishing points on the left or on the right. So let's look at how some artists use these. This is Rafael's School of Athens, which is in the Vatican Museum. And it's actually a fresco mural. You can see on the left there in the lower left-hand corner, there's a door. So this is painted on the walls of the room. And this is an example of a single point linear perspective. You can see on the right the different lines coming down to that point right in the middle between Socrates and Plato as they're having their philosophical debate. This is everything from the grid and the arch of the roof to the grid on the floor, the tops of the columns on the walls. Everything is going down to that point in the middle. And if we look carefully at this painting, we'll see it composes a number of different philosophers from all different time periods into one image. Like I said, there's Socrates and Plato in the middle. Euclid is there, as well as a number of other Renaissance and earlier philosophers. So here we have a sort of multiple point perspective, or vanishing point perspective, where we can see that big building in the upper left has two vanishing points that its walls are going down into. The horizon line is kind of high, but interesting compositionally, goes right through the eyes of the man and woman in the foreground, creating this sort of large empty space in the lower left. Another kind of perspective is atmospheric perspective, also called aerial perspective. And in atmospheric perspective, there's sort of a texture gradient where closer objects are rougher or more detailed, whereas distant objects get more blurred and softer. There can also be a brightness gradient where those blurred, soft, distant objects are less intense than the ones closer up. And the classic example of this is looking out at overlapping mountain ranges. So you can see in this painting by Sylvia Mangold, the first hill there has a very clear, very rough contour line describing it. We can see there's even trees and bushes. It's very dark, intense color. The second hill or mountain range is still fairly clear. We can easily see that contour line, but it's much less intense in color, and it's just slightly softer. And then it's very hard to see, but we can barely see this third mountain range in the background. It's very soft, really low intensity, but it gives us a sense of the tremendous space between someone's standing up on this hill looking over to that far peak. The last visual elements we're going to look at are time and motion. And again, we have a difference between actual motion and implied motion. Actual motion are things like kinetic art that actually moves, like mobiles. And here's an example of a mobile by Alexander Calder, where given a very slight breeze, these different shapes start spinning around, changing the composition of the piece. Implied motion, however, looks like time that is stopped, right? And these works try to capture an event as it's occurring, versus time implied or motion implied, which try to which are works that try to show that some motion happened or that some time has passed. So as an example, this Baroque marble sculpture by Bernini, which is at the Borghese Gallery in Rome, of Apollo and Daphne, has a great sense of stopped motion, or stopped time. We've got Daphne, the nymph, running from Apollo, and if you don't know the myth of Apollo and Daphne, Apollo really likes Daphne and he's chasing after her. Daphne doesn't want anything to do with Apollo, and so she prays to the gods to save her, and they do, but they do so by turning her into a tree. So you can see at this time the sort of mid-transformation of Daphne into the tree. Her fingers are sprouting leaves, her one leg is turning into a tree trunk, and the great thing that Bernini has done here is he's showing us that an instant of that transformation moment. He's not showing us after she turns into a tree. He's not showing us while she's praying to be saved from Apollo. He's showing us the moment in between, the moment the action is occurring. And we have other things that give us the sense of motion. Apollo, his one foot is raised on the leg behind. His arms are sort of flailing like he's mid-stride and running. So there's a lot of action and motion in this sculpture that doesn't actually move. It's all implied. So, implied motion is reference to motion that has happened. The illusion of motion is the illusion of motion that's happening right now. There are a lot of early photographic experiments that try to show motion as it's occurring. Another way artists will try to give the illusion of motion is by blurring the edges of something like a race car that will have a blurry streak behind it, indicating it's going very fast. Op art creates an illusion of motion in our minds as well. And then other forms of cinematography and video create the illusion of motion over time. So here are some more examples. Man pole vaulting gives us the illusion of motion as this guy jumping on the pole vault. And Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, again, suggests that time is passing, or suggests the movement of the person, the figure, down the staircase. Op art is a very specific style of painting gives us a sense of creating movement based on color, shape, line, repetition, and vibrancy. And after image is a color or image we see after we stare at something for too long and look away. And we'll see a good example of this when we look at color. But here's an example of op art. Sometimes they can be hard to look at, but if you don't try to focus on any one part of the image, it really looks like these swirly shapes are squiggling or vibrating around on the image. Okay, we are almost done. I'd like you to get out some paper, and I'm going to go through these slides and ask you about the images they show, and write down your answers on the paper. You may need to pause the video periodically if you need more time to think about the solution. So, in these images, what are the kinds of line that are being used? Actual or contour lines? What about in these images? Are the lines actual or contour lines? What are the implied shapes you see in these images? Or should we say, what is the psychological structure of these Renaissance paintings? Looking at these sculptures, what kind of shape are they? What about these? What shapes are represented here? Can you identify the kinds of perspective used in these images? What about these ones? What kind of space is being created here? Or how is the space being created in these images? Are these high or low contrast? Now take a minute, without looking at your notes. Do you remember all 9 of the visual elements and their associated definitions? Try. If you missed any, go back to your notes and refresh your memory. Be sure you have a clear list of visual elements and design principles in your notes. We'll talk about the design principles in a little bit. Alright, the last activity is to choose one of these 3 images and identify the most important visual element you see in the image, describe it, and explain how it functions. Write this down. And again, you only have to do it for one of the images. Alright, that wraps up the visual elements of art. I'll see you in a little bit.